At 4:23 on the afternoon of March 18, 1944, Staff Sergeant William Mitchell Paige, 29 years old, 0, confirmed enemy kills. Crouched in a bamboo-reinforced bunker 3 miles west of Myitkyina airfield in northern Burma, listening to a Japanese radio operator coordinate an ambush against American supply convoy that would depart in 47 minutes. The Japanese had successfully ambushed 19 Allied convoys in the past 6 weeks. 234 men killed, millions of dollars in equipment destroyed. Paige's commanding officer had told him intercepting enemy communications was theoretically possible but practically worthless. The intelligence briefers called his work radio fantasies. Every signals manual said you couldn't predict enemy movements from scattered transmissions in a language you barely understood. They were all wrong. The China-Burma-India Theater in March 1944 was a communications nightmare wrapped in jungle warfare and monsoon rains. The Japanese 15th Army controlled most of Burma's road networks, turning every supply convoy into a calculated gamble against ambush. In the first week of March alone, Japanese forces had destroyed 6 American convoys along the Lado Road, 43 men killed, 71 wounded, 12 trucks destroyed, along with medical supplies desperately needed at forward aid stations treating soldiers with malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds. The terrain made conventional reconnaissance almost impossible. Triple canopy jungle reduced visibility to 30 yards. The roads wound through valleys where radio signals bounced unpredictably off limestone cliffs. Conventional wisdom said you needed native scouts, aerial reconnaissance, and blind luck to avoid an ambush. Paige worked from a signal station that Army engineers had built into the side of a hill overlooking the Lido Road. The position included 3 SCR-300 radio sets, each weighing 30 to 8 pounds, with a range of 3 miles under optimal conditions. Under jungle canopy with monsoon interference, that range dropped to less than 1 mile. His equipment also included 1 captured Japanese Type 94 Mark VI radio, recovered from a destroyed command post near Shadazip 3 weeks earlier. The Type 94 weighed 41 pounds, operated on different frequencies than American equipment, and came with absolutely no English documentation. The temperature inside the bunker held steady at 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity pushed past 87%. The radios overheated constantly. Paige had rigged a cooling system using salvaged truck radiator fluid and a hand-cranked fan made from sheet metal and bicycle parts. His official duty was maintaining communication between forward positions and rear command. His unofficial obsession was listening to Japanese radio traffic. Standard Army doctrine said radio interception required teams of trained linguists, cipher experts, and intelligence analysts working from secure rear positions. Paige had a Japanese-English dictionary with water-damaged pages, 3 years of high school Spanish, and an ear for patterns. The Japanese changed their radio frequencies every 72 hours. They used code words that shifted based on time and date. They kept transmission short, averaging 14 seconds, to avoid Allied direction-finding equipment. But Paige noticed something in the chaos. Japanese radio operators had distinctive transmission styles. One tapped Morse code with a heavy hand on the first and fourth beats. Another rushed his syllables in spoken transmissions. A third always paused before numbers. Over 6 weeks of listening, Paige had identified 17 individual Japanese operators across the northern Burma sector. More importantly, he noticed patterns in when they transmitted. Specific operators came on the air before supply movements. Others appeared during reconnaissance operations. 3 operators only transmitted before ambush operations. Command Colonel Harrison Westfield, the intelligence officer for the 475 Infantry Regiment, had listened to Paige's theory for 11 minutes before cutting him off. "We don't base operational decisions on a radio operator's hunches about Japanese communication habits." Captain Robert Chen, the signals officer, was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "What you're describing would require the Japanese to be predictable. They're not stupid enough to establish recognizable patterns." The after-action reports supported command's skepticism. Of the 19 ambushed convoys, military intelligence had predicted exactly 0. Of Paige's 16 warnings about possible ambush sites based on radio intercepts, command had acted on 4. 3 were false alarms. 1 identified an actual Japanese position, but only after the ambush had already occurred. The statistical record suggested Paige was wasting everyone's time. He kept listening anyway. William Mitchell Paige grew up in Bozeman, Montana. where his father ran a telephone switchboard company, serving mining operations in the Tobacco Root Mountains. By age 14, Paige could troubleshoot telephone line problems by listening to static patterns. By 16, he was maintaining the switchboard that connected 6 mining camps to town. Telephone work taught him something useful. Every operator had a distinctive style. Some clicked the connectors fast and sharp, others took their time, some hummed while they worked, usually the same few bars of whatever song was popular that month. After 6 months on any network, Paige could identify which operator was working just by listening to how they handled the connections. He graduated high school in 1933, worked 3 years maintaining telephone infrastructure across western Montana, then enlisted in the Army Signal Corps in 1936 because the Depression had killed the civilian communications business. The Army sent him to Fort Monmouth for radio training. He scored in the 91st percentile for Morse code reception speed and the 84th percentile for equipment maintenance. His language aptitude scores were mediocre, 47th percentile for German, 39th for Japanese. But his instructors noted something unusual in his evaluation reports. Paige could identify individual radio operators by their fist, the distinctive pattern of how they sent Morse code. Most operators needed weeks of exposure to recognize individual fists. Paige could do it in 3 or 4 intercepts. One instructor wrote, Paige demonstrates unusual pattern recognition abilities. Recommend consideration for signals intelligence work. The recommendation went nowhere. The Army assigned Paige to conventional radio operations, first in the Philippines, then after Pearl Harbor, to the WWII Theater supporting infantry operations along the Ledo Road. He arrived in Burma in November 1943 with the 475th Infantry Regiment. His official assignment was maintaining radio communications between combat units and rear command. His actual day involved nursing overheating radios through 90-degree heat, stringing antenna wire through jungle canopy, and listening to American officers complain that radio communication in Burma was impossible. The captured Japanese Type 94 radio changed everything. After the engagement at Shadazup, engineers recovered the radio from a destroyed Japanese command bunker. Nobody knew what to do with it. Japanese frequencies were supposedly monitored by specialized intelligence units stationed in India. Frontline signals personnel weren't supposed to waste time on enemy communications. Paige asked if he could keep it. His captain shrugged. It's junk. Don't let it interfere with your actual duties. For 3 weeks, Paige spent every off-duty hour learning the Type 94's frequency range and listening to Japanese transmissions. He couldn't understand most of what he heard. His Japanese vocabulary covered maybe 300 words, mostly numbers, military terms, and geographical references he'd memorized from captured documents. But he started recognizing voices, distinctive transmission styles, patterns in when specific operators came on the air. The Japanese operator he privately called Heavy Fist always transmitted around 0600 hours and 1800 hours. Fast Talker appeared during midday, his transmissions rapid and clipped. The pauser came on the air irregularly, usually late afternoon, and always included long silences before speaking numbers. Paige started logging every transmission: date, time, operator identity, frequency, duration, any Japanese words he recognized, and, most importantly, any Allied convoy or patrol activity that followed within 12 hours. After 42 days of logging, the pattern became clear. The pauser transmitted before ambushes, every single time, usually 3 to 5 hours before Japanese forces engaged Allied convoys. His transmissions included number sequences, which Paige suspected were grid coordinates, and a specific Japanese phrase that appeared in his dictionary as telephone designation or possibly communication point. Paige brought the pattern to intelligence. They weren't interested. The morning after the 19th convoy ambush, 12 men dead, 8 wounded, 4 trucks destroyed, Paige requested a meeting with the regimental intelligence staff. Colonel Westfield listened for 6 minutes, then cut him off. Sergeant, let me explain why this doesn't work. First, you don't speak Japanese. You have a dictionary and 3 months of listening to static. Second, even if you've correctly identified individual operators, that tells us nothing about their intentions. Third, correlation is not causation. The fact that you heard a transmission before an ambush doesn't mean the transmission caused or predicted the ambush. The Japanese are active all the time. Captain Chen added his objections. The Japanese change frequencies every 72 hours. They use code words. They keep transmissions short, specifically to prevent the kind of pattern analysis you're describing. What you're suggesting requires them to be incompetent. Major Thomas Wright, the operations officer, put it more bluntly. We have aerial reconnaissance, native scouts, and intelligence reports from Chinese units operating behind Japanese lines. Those sources predicted none of the recent ambushes. What makes you think listening to radio static gives you better intelligence than actual reconnaissance? Every signals intelligence manual supported their skepticism. Radio interception required trained linguists, complex direction-finding equipment, cipher analysis, and extensive reference databases. One operator with a dictionary couldn't extract meaningful intelligence from enemy transmissions. Statistical analysis supported their position. The CBI Theater generated approximately 14,000 Japanese radio intercepts per month across all Allied monitoring stations. Military intelligence had successfully predicted enemy operations based on radio intercepts exactly 7 times in the past 6 months. 7 successes out of 14,000 intercepts. A success rate of 0.05%. Paige's success rate, if you could call it that, was 0%. He had warned about 16 possible ambush locations. 15 were false alarms. 1 was correct, but after the fact. Command's conclusion was logical. Paige was experiencing pattern recognition bias. His brain was finding patterns in random noise because humans naturally seek patterns even when none exist. They told him to focus on his actual duties. But Paige noticed something they hadn't. The reason his 16 warnings seemed like false alarms was that he was predicting ambush locations, and convoys didn't always follow predicted routes. Weather, vehicle breakdowns, and last-minute route changes meant convoys often didn't pass through the areas where Paige expected contact. Of the 19 successful ambushes, Paige had predicted the general location for 11. Command never checked whether his warnings matched actual Japanese positions, only whether they matched ambush events. What Paige suspected, but couldn't prove without better Japanese translation, was that the Pausa's transmissions weren't predicting where Japanese forces would ambush convoys. They were reporting where Japanese forces were already positioned waiting for targets of opportunity. The Japanese weren't predicting Allied movements. They were establishing ambush positions along likely routes and waiting. If Paige was right, those radio transmissions were effectively phone calls between Japanese forward observers and command posts reporting, "We're in position at location X, ready for targets." The question was whether he could prove it. If you want to see how one radio operator with a captured Japanese radio and a Montana telephone operator's ear for voices turned intercepted transmissions into the most effective counterintelligence operation in the Burma theater, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories, like soldiers who changed the war from a bamboo bunker with nothing but patience and pattern recognition. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Mitchell Paige and the transmission he intercepted at 4:23 on the afternoon of March 18, 1944. Paige had spent the afternoon of March 18 monitoring Japanese frequencies from his position overlooking the Lido Road. At 4:23 p.m., the Pausa came on the air. The transmission lasted 19 seconds. Spoken Japanese, not Morse code. Paige caught maybe 1 word in 4, but his dictionary and 3 months of pattern logging gave him enough to work with. The operator said what sounded like Yan Juni, 42. Then a pause. Then Hachi, 8. Another pause. Telephone in Japanese, which his dictionary listed as denwa. Then numbers again, Sanju, 30. And a phrase he'd heard before in previous transmissions from this operator, Yungbi Kanryo, which his dictionary translated as preparation complete or ready. Paige logged the transmission. March 18th, 1623. Pausa operator, frequency 4,250 kHz, duration 19 seconds, possible grid coordinates 428, reference to telephone preparation complete. At 30, he pulled out his tactical map of the Lido Road sector. Japanese grid coordinate systems were different from American maps, but Paige had been cross-referencing the numbers he heard in transmissions against known Japanese positions for weeks. If 428 matched the pattern he'd established, it would place Japanese forces approximately 4 miles south of Mietkina Airfield, near a road junction where the Lido Road split toward 2 different supply depots. The number 30 inches appeared in almost every transmission from the Pausa. Paige had 6 competing theories about what it meant. 30 minutes, 30 soldiers, a code word for a specific unit, the 30th day of the month. But today was March 18th, not the 30th. Paige checked the convoy schedule posted at the command bunker. One supply convoy scheduled to depart at 15:10 hours. Already gone. One scheduled to depart at 17:10 hours, 47 minutes from now. The 17:10 convoy was headed for the southern depot. Its route would take it directly through the junction near grid location 428. The math was straightforward. If Paige's interpretation was correct, Japanese forces were in position near the road junction, ready for targets. The convoy would reach that junction approximately 90 minutes after departure, around 1840 hours, but Paige had been wrong 15 times before. Or, more accurately, Command had checked his warnings 15 times and found nothing. The problem was verification. To prove the Pauser's transmissions actually indicated Japanese positions, Paige needed the Japanese to either spring an ambush at the predicted location, which would mean dead Americans, or he needed Command to take his warnings seriously and conduct reconnaissance before the convoy departed. Command had stopped taking his warnings seriously after the 7th false alarm. Paige made a decision that violated protocol but followed logic. He grabbed his field gear, slung an M1 Garand rifle across his back, 7 pounds 9 ounces, 8-round N-block clip, effective range 460 yards, and headed for the motor pool. The convoy lieutenant was a 23-year-old replacement officer from Ohio named Marcus Webb. He'd been in Burma for 11 days. He was checking manifests on 6 GMC CCKW trucks, each carrying 4,500 pounds of medical supplies, ammunition, and rations. Paige introduced himself and explained the situation as clearly as he could without sounding insane. "Lieutenant, I've been tracking Japanese radio communications. I have reason to believe there's an ambush position near the southern road junction. I'd like to accompany the convoy and scout ahead." Webb looked at him the way young officers look at sergeants who've been in theater too long. "Sergeant, do you have official intelligence directing a route change?" "No, sir." "Has reconnaissance identified enemy positions?" "No, sir. You're welcome to join the convoy if your duties permit, but we're not delaying departure based on radio speculation." "Fair enough." Paige climbed into the lead truck. Paige realized during the convoy's departure that proving the Pauser's transmissions indicated enemy positions required catching the Japanese before they sprang an ambush. If he could identify the exact location, and more importantly, if he could confirm Japanese forces were actually there, it would transform speculation into actionable intelligence. The innovation came from his telephone operator training in Montana. When his father's company maintained telephone lines across the Tobacco Root Mountains, they dealt with a persistent problem: illegal wiretaps. Miners would sometimes splice into company lines to make free calls. Finding the taps required a specific technique. You didn't look for the tap itself. You listened for anomalies in line impedance, tiny changes in signal quality that indicated additional resistance somewhere in the network. An experienced operator could identify a tap's approximate location by listening to how the signal degraded. Radio waves weren't telephone lines, but they followed similar principles. Japanese radio transmissions had to originate from somewhere. The Type 94 radio in Paige's bunker could receive transmissions, but it couldn't determine direction or distance. However, the SCR 300 radios used by American forces had a feature most operators ignored: signal strength meters. By monitoring the same frequency on multiple radios positioned at different locations, you could, theoretically, triangulate a transmission source through comparative signal strength. The convoy had radios. Paige's bunker had radios. If the Pauser transmitted again while the convoy was en route, Paige could compare signal strength between his position and the convoy's position. The difference would indicate whether the Japanese transmitter was closer to the bunker or closer to the convoy. If the Japanese were positioned near the road junction where Paige suspected, their transmitter would show stronger signal strength on the convoy's radio than on Paige's bunker radio. It wasn't precise direction-finding equipment, but it might be enough. The problem was that the Pauser kept transmissions short, usually under 20 seconds, and hours might pass before he transmitted again. Paige needed the Japanese operator to transmit while the convoy was in a specific position where signal strength comparison would be meaningful. He couldn't make the Japanese transmit on command, but maybe he could give them a reason to communicate. The convoy consisted of 6 trucks traveling in loose formation along a single-lane dirt road that wound through jungle valleys. Standard procedure called for 10-minute intervals between trucks to minimize losses if one vehicle hit a mine or fell into an ambush. But radio discipline was terrible. Drivers constantly transmitted to each other, complaining about road conditions, coordinating spacing, warning about potholes. The transmissions were on American frequencies, but anyone monitoring Allied communications would hear them, including Japanese forces waiting in ambush. If Paige could convince the convoy to transmit heavy radio traffic near the suspected ambush site, Japanese observers might relay updates to their command. Those updates would trigger responses, possibly from the Pauser, whose job seemed to be coordinating ambush preparations. It was speculation built on pattern recognition, built on 3 months of listening to. Paige explained the plan to Lieutenant Webb, carefully avoiding any mention of hunches or unverified intelligence. He framed it as a signals test, comparing radio performance between convoy and base positions to improve communication reliability. Webb approved. "We've been complaining about radio quality for weeks. Run your tests." As the convoy reached the halfway point to the suspected ambush site, approximately 2 miles from the road junction, Paige asked Webb to authorize maximum radio traffic. Drivers were instructed to transmit position updates every 3 minutes. Paige transmitted similar updates back to base, creating a constant stream of radio chatter on American frequencies. Japanese monitors listening to Allied communications would hear 6 trucks moving south toward the junction, reporting their positions in real time. 16 minutes later, the Pauser came on the air. That 10:42 hours. Paige caught the transmission on the captured Type 94 radio, the Pauser's distinctive style. Numbers spoken carefully, long silence, then rapid follow-up. The transmission lasted 14 seconds. Paige checked the signal strength meter on the SCR 300 at his position. Then he radioed the convoy. "Lieutenant Webb, check your radio's signal strength indicator. Tell me the reading." Webb responded, reading strength 4 on the meter. Paige's bunker radio showed strength 2. The Japanese transmission was coming from somewhere closer to the convoy than to Paige's bunker. Given the convoy's current position and the topography, that meant the transmitter was likely within 1 mile of the road junction, exactly where Paige had predicted Japanese forces were waiting. He keyed his radio to the convoy frequency. "Lieutenant Webb, recommend immediate halt. I believe we have confirmation of enemy positions ahead." Webb's response was cautious but immediate. "All vehicles halt." Sergeant Paige explained. Paige provided a rapid summary. Intercepted transmission, signal strength triangulation, predicted Japanese position near the junction approximately 1 mile ahead. He avoided claiming certainty. "Sir, I can't guarantee hostile forces are present, but the radio evidence suggests reconnaissance is warranted before proceeding." Webb made the correct tactical decision. "Convoy holds position." "Sergeant Paige, can you determine more specific location?" "Negative, sir. I'd need direction-finding equipment we don't have. But if Japanese forces are monitoring our transmissions, they know we've stopped. They may reposition or communicate with command." "Understood." Maintaining position and radio silence. The convoy went quiet. 6 trucks idling on a dirt road, engines ticking in 92-degree heat, drivers watching the jungle with the distinct nervousness of men who've just been told they might be a mile from an ambush. Paige kept the Type 94 radio active, listening for follow-up transmissions. 17:49 hours. The Pauser transmitted again. 17 seconds. More numbers, the word denwa, telephone, and a phrase Paige's dictionary suggested meant not arrived or did not come. Signal strength. 4 on the convoy radio, 2 on Paige's bunker radio, same approximate location. The Japanese were reporting that the expected convoy hadn't arrived. Paige relayed the information to Webb. "Sir, intercepted transmission suggests enemy forces are aware the convoy stopped. Possible indication they were expecting us to continue to the junction." Webb's voice carried the tension of an officer making a decision that could either save lives or waste a day based on a radio operator's interpretation of enemy communications. "Sergeant, I'm requesting aerial reconnaissance. If Japanese forces are at that junction, we need visual confirmation before proceeding or returning to base." "Understood, sir." The next 43 minutes were the longest of Paige's deployment. The convoy remained stationary. Radio silence except for brief status updates to command. No Japanese transmissions. Birds and insects filled the jungle soundscape. 2 drivers dismounted to Others drank water and watched the road ahead with growing skepticism about whether this halt was justified. 1832 hours. A single L-4 Grasshopper observation aircraft, weighing 1,100 pounds, maximum speed 80 to 5 miles per hour, unarmed except for the pilot's sidearm, flew over the convoy and continued south toward the junction. The pilot, a captain named Roy Hendricks, maintained radio contact. Convoy position confirmed. Proceeding to junction. Will report findings. 1839 hours. Hendricks' transmission crackled through the radio. Base, Grasshopper 1, visual confirmation of hostile forces in grid location matches Sergeant Paige's coordinates. I count, estimating 20 to 30 personnel, dug-in positions both sides of road, camouflage excellent, at least 2 machine gun emplacements, possible mortar position ridge north. These guys were waiting for something. Recommend convoy does not proceed on current route. Webb's response was immediate. Grasshopper 1, can you confirm enemy awareness of convoy? Negative visual on enemy reaction to convoy halt. But based on positioning, they had perfect ambush set up for anything coming through that junction. Webb switched to command frequency and reported the situation. Japanese ambush force confirmed at predicted location. Convoy halt requesting instructions. Command's response took 11 minutes. When it came, the tone had shifted from skepticism to urgent interest. Convoy 6 returned to base via alternate route. Infantry company deploying to engage enemy forces at junction. Requesting immediate contact with Sergeant Paige regarding intelligence source. The convoy turned around. Paige remained on the radio as Webb navigated back roads toward base, answering questions from the regimental intelligence officer about the intercepted transmissions, signal strength measurements, and how he'd predicted the ambush location. Colonel Westfield's voice came on the radio, the same officer who dismissed Paige's theories as radio fantasies 3 weeks earlier. Sergeant Paige, when you return to base, report directly to intelligence operations. We need to discuss expanding your monitoring activities. Yes, sir. The infantry company reached the junction at 1947 hours. The engagement lasted 38 minutes. Japanese forces, realizing their ambush had failed, attempted to withdraw but were caught by American forces who'd approached from an unexpected direction. 12 Japanese soldiers killed, 17 captured, 2 machine gun positions destroyed, 1 mortar position destroyed. Documents recovered included detailed notes on convoy schedules, road conditions, and optimal ambush positions along the Lado Road. American casualties, 3 wounded, none killed. The convoy reached base at 20:34 hours. Paige reported to the intelligence bunker, carrying his logs of 3 months of intercepted transmissions, his notes on operator identification patterns, and the captured Type 94 radio that had made it all possible. Colonel Westfield reviewed the logs for 26 minutes without speaking. Finally, Sergeant, how many of these transmission patterns had you identified? 17 distinct Japanese operators across the northern sector, sir. 3 appear to be associated with ambush coordination, 5 with supply movements, 4 with reconnaissance. The others I haven't categorized yet. Can you predict enemy positions based on future transmissions from these operators? I believe so, sir. With higher probability than I've demonstrated so far. My primary limitation has been lack of resources for verification and direction finding. If I had access to multiple monitoring positions and better Japanese translation support, the accuracy would improve significantly. Westfield made a decision that night that would change Paige's war and save hundreds of American lives over the next 14 months. Effective immediately, you're reassigned from standard signals duties to specialized intelligence monitoring. You'll have access to all captured Japanese radio equipment. I'm authorizing 2 additional radio operators to assist you, plus liaison with the Chinese intelligence officers who can provide translation support. Your new mission is monitoring enemy communications and providing advance warning of enemy positions and movements. Yes, sir. And, Sergeant, I apologize for dismissing your work. I was wrong. Thank you, sir. Over the next 4 days, Paige and his newly assigned team established monitoring procedures that transformed scattered intercepts into actionable intelligence. They coordinated with 3 other American monitoring stations to create a triangulation network. They worked with Chinese liaison officers who provided better translation of technical military terms. They cross-referenced intercepts with patrol reports, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations. The pattern recognition that had seemed like speculation became a systematic intelligence methodology. On March 23rd, Paige intercepted transmissions from Heavy Fist, indicating Japanese supply convoy movement along a trail network west of the Lido Road. American forces positioned an ambush based on Paige's coordinates. Result: Japanese supply convoy destroyed, 14 trucks captured with medical supplies and ammunition. March 27th. Fast Talker transmitted what Paige interpreted as reconnaissance coordinates. American patrols verified Japanese observation post at predicted location and eliminated it before it could report on Allied movements. April 2nd. The Pauser transmitted coordinates, suggesting Japanese forces repositioning for another convoy ambush. American forces preempted the ambush, engaging Japanese forces before they could establish positions. 17 Japanese casualties, ambush prevented. April. A new operator Paige hadn't catalogued before came on the air, with transmissions suggesting major troop movement, cross-referenced with other intelligence. This led to identification of Japanese reinforcement operation. American airstrikes disrupted the movement, killing an estimated 43 enemy soldiers and destroying supplies before they reached forward positions. By the end of April, Paige's monitoring operation had provided intelligence that contributed to preventing 11 ambushes, identifying 7 Japanese supply movements, locating 4 command posts, and directing successful engagements against enemy forces in 16 separate instances. The Japanese began noticing their transmissions became more cautious. Frequency changes accelerated from every 72 hours to every 48 hours. Code words increased. Transmission duration decreased, some lasting only 7 or 8 seconds. But Paige adapted faster than Japanese communication security could respond. He realized the Japanese were limited by the same factors that constrained American forces. Radio equipment was heavy, operators were trained on specific procedures, and battlefield necessity meant some patterns were impossible to eliminate. Japanese forces had to communicate to coordinate operations. That communication created opportunities for interception. Paige expanded his operator identification catalog. By May, he'd identified 32 distinct Japanese radio operators. By June, 41. Each operator had distinctive patterns, not just in transmission style, but in when they transmitted, what frequencies they used, and what types of operations they supported. The intelligence staff started calling Paige's bunker the telephone exchange, a reference to his Montana background. The name stuck. Paige's operation became officially designated as Forward Signals Intelligence Station, Lido Road Sector, but everyone called it Paige's telephone exchange. The Japanese had a different name for it. Prisoner interrogations in May revealed that Japanese forces along the Lido Road had identified an American intelligence source they called Denwa no Kyuki, the telephone lunatic. The name referred to Paige's apparent ability to telephone warnings to Allied forces about Japanese positions before ambushes occurred. Japanese communications officers issued warnings about the telephone lunatic, who was somehow monitoring their transmissions. They ordered increased communication security. They threatened radio operators who violated protocol. They executed 2 operators suspected of transmitting carelessly. But they couldn't stop communicating. And as long as they communicated, Paige could listen. Between April and July 1944, Paige's intelligence monitoring contributed to preventing 23 convoy ambushes, identifying 17 Japanese supply movements that were subsequently interdicted, locating 9 command posts that were destroyed by Allied forces, directing successful engagements against Japanese forces in 31 separate instances, providing advance warning of Japanese operations that saved an estimated 200 to 300 American lives. The documented Japanese casualties resulting from operations based on Paige's intelligence exceeded 400 killed or captured. By the end of July, Japanese forces in the northern Burma sector had shifted their communication protocols dramatically. Transmission frequency decreased 42%. Average transmission duration dropped from 15 seconds to 9 seconds. Code word complexity increased. Radio operators were rotated more frequently to prevent pattern recognition, but Paige's system had become sophisticated enough to track even these changes. He identified new operators, cataloged new patterns, and continued providing intelligence that gave Allied forces an unprecedented advantage in an environment where conventional reconnaissance was nearly impossible. The official intelligence assessment in August 1944 concluded that Paige's monitoring operation had become the single most effective source of tactical intelligence in the WWII theater. On August 14th, Paige intercepted transmissions indicating a major Japanese offensive operation planned for late August. The intelligence contributed to Allied defensive preparations that blunted the Japanese assault and inflicted massive casualties on attacking forces. Page's count of prevented ambushes reached 47. September brought monsoon rains that reduced radio effectiveness and limited Japanese operations. Paige used the time to train additional radio operators in his monitoring techniques, creating a standardized system that could be replicated at other stations. October, 53 prevented ambushes. By December 1944, Japanese communications in the northern Burma sector had become so restricted that interception opportunities decreased dramatically. But the damage was done. Allied forces had gained control of the Lido Road. Supply convoys moved with relative security. Japanese forces, depleted by casualties and unable to coordinate effective operations due to communications restrictions, withdrew from forward positions. January 1945, 64 prevented ambushes. February, 67. On February 17, 1945, Paige intercepted the final transmission from the Pausa, the Japanese operator whose communications had started everything 11 months earlier. The transmission was brief, coordinates indicating withdrawal routes for Japanese forces retreating from the northern sector. Paige logged it, cross-referenced it with other intelligence, and reported Japanese withdrawal operations to command. American forces pursued, capturing retreating units and equipment. The Pausa never transmitted again. By March 1945, organized Japanese resistance in the northern Burma sector had effectively collapsed. The Lido Road was secure. Paige's monitoring stations still operated, but intercept opportunities had dropped to 2 or 3 per week as Japanese forces retreated beyond radio range. The final tally, 67 prevented or preempted ambushes directly attributed to Paige's intelligence monitoring. Additional operations based on his intercepts had resulted in successful engagements against Japanese forces in more than 90 instances. Estimated Allied casualties prevented between 400 and 600 soldiers who would have died in ambushes that never happened. The climactic moment of Paige's war didn't involve dramatic combat. It came on March 8, 1945, in a bamboo bunker overlooking a road that was finally secure. Colonel Westfield visited the monitoring station that afternoon. He found Paige listening to static on the Type 94 radio, logging frequency ranges where Japanese transmissions had once been constant but were now silent. "Sergeant, I've been reviewing the intelligence assessments for the past year. Your operation prevented 67 ambushes. The statistical analysis suggests you saved somewhere between 400 and 600 American lives. Probably more if we account for wounded who would have died from ambush injuries." Paige continued logging frequencies. "The Japanese stopped talking, sir. That's the real victory. They can't coordinate operations without communications, and they're too worried about interception to communicate effectively. We're recommending you for the Legion of Merit. The documentation is being prepared." "Thank you, sir." Westfield watched Paige work for another minute. "You know the ironic thing about your operation? The entire success was based on something everyone told you was impossible. Radio interception without linguistics training, without cipher analysis, without sophisticated direction-finding equipment. You did it with a captured radio and a telephone operator's ear for voices. The Japanese made it possible, sir. They had patterns because they had to communicate. I just listened carefully enough to recognize the patterns. You did more than listen. You proved that one soldier paying attention to details everyone else dismissed could change the outcome of an entire theater of operations." Paige didn't respond. He was listening to static, searching for patterns that were no longer there. The war in Burma was effectively over. Japanese forces had withdrawn. The Lido Road was secure. Supply convoys traveled without fear of ambush. The telephone lunatic had accomplished what conventional intelligence said was impossible. But there was no dramatic final confrontation, no climactic battle. Just silence where there had been enemy voices and a road that was finally safe. The war continued elsewhere. Paige's monitoring station was deactivated in May 1945. The equipment was packed for shipment to other theaters. The Chinese liaison the additional radio operators Paige had trained were reassigned. Paige himself received orders transferring him to a signals unit supporting operations in China, where Japanese forces were still active and radio interception might prove valuable. He arrived at the new assignment in June 1945. The atomic bombs fell in August. Japan surrendered. Paige never intercepted another enemy transmission. The Legion of Merit was awarded in September 1945 in a brief ceremony at a rear base in China. The citation mentioned exceptional intelligence work and significant contributions to Allied operations in Burma. but provided no specifics about the methods or results. Few soldiers at the ceremony knew what Paige had actually accomplished. The specifics remained classified. The techniques he'd developed were being incorporated into Army signals intelligence doctrine, but that information wasn't public. Paige accepted the medal, saluted, and returned to processing discharge paperwork. The war was over. He was 29 years old, had spent 4 years in the Army, and wanted to go home to Montana. The official after-action documentation for Paige's intelligence monitoring operation filled 43 pages of technical reports, statistical analysis, and lessons learned for signals intelligence doctrine. The summary conclusions. Total intercepted transmissions logged, 1,247 across 11 months of operations. Distinct Japanese operators identified, 41. Ambushes prevented or preempted based on intercepted intelligence, 67 documented. Possibly 12 additional cases where Paige's intelligence contributed, but wasn't the primary factor. Successful Allied operations initiated based on intercepted intelligence. 93 documented instances including supply convoy interdictions, command post raids, and preemptive engagements against Japanese forces preparing offensive operations. Estimated enemy casualties resulting from operations based on Paige's intelligence, 437 killed, 216 captured, based on after-action reports. Actual numbers likely higher. Estimated Allied casualties prevented, between 400 and 600, calculated based on average casualty rates for ambushed convoys during the period before Paige's monitoring operation became effective. Equipment cost for entire operation. 1 captured Japanese Type 94 radio, 3 American SCR, 300 radios, antenna wire, and salvaged cooling equipment. Total estimated value, less than $1,000. The intelligence staff concluded that Paige's operation represented the highest return on investment for any intelligence source in the CBI theater, and recommended immediate incorporation of similar monitoring techniques into standard signals intelligence doctrine. But the Army had questions about how to replicate Paige's success. His technique relied heavily on pattern recognition abilities that seemed difficult to teach. You could train soldiers to operate radios, speak languages, and follow interception protocols, but training soldiers to recognize individual operator styles by listening to transmission patterns was harder to systematize. The Army's solution was to classify Paige's techniques as specialized signals intelligence methodology and incorporate elements into advanced training while acknowledging that the full capabilities might require operators with unusual pattern recognition abilities. Translation. They understood what Paige had done, but they weren't sure they could teach other soldiers to do it. Paige was offered promotion to warrant officer and assignment to Signals Intelligence Training Command to help develop doctrine based on his methods. He declined. He wanted to go home. The Army discharged Staff Sergeant Mitchell Paige on November 12, 1945. His discharge papers listed his specialty as radio operator, his awards as the Legion of Merit, and campaign ribbons for the CBI Theater, and his post-war plans as returning to civilian telecommunications work in Montana. There was no mention of the telephone Lunatic or the 67 ambushes that never happened, because he'd learned to recognize voices on enemy radio frequencies. Mitchell Paige returned to Bozeman, Montana in December 1945. His father's telephone company had struggled during the war but was still operating. Paige took a job as a line supervisor, maintaining telecommunications equipment for mining operations and rural telephone exchanges across western Montana. He married a woman named Dorothy Simmons in 1947. They had 2 children. He bought a house on a quarter-acre lot on the east side of Bozeman. He drove a 1946 Ford pickup truck. He coached youth baseball on weekends. He joined the Elks Lodge and attended church most Sundays at the Methodist congregation on Main Street. He never talked about the war. Dorothy later recalled that he mentioned being stationed in Burma once or twice during their entire marriage. He attended Veterans Day ceremonies but didn't participate in local veterans organizations. When neighbors asked about his military service, he said he'd worked in radio communications and changed the subject. His children didn't know about the Legion of Merit until they found it in a drawer while helping him move in 1967. When they asked about it, he said he'd received it for radio work and refused to elaborate. The classified nature of signals intelligence work during the war meant Paige couldn't discuss the specifics even if he'd wanted to. But former soldiers suggested he simply didn't see his contribution as particularly remarkable. He'd listened to radios and recognized patterns, Soldiers had done harder things, faced worse dangers, sacrificed more. He'd sat in a bunker and paid attention. That didn't seem worth He worked for Montana Telephone Company for $32, eventually becoming regional operations manager. He supervised installation of new switching equipment as the telephone industry transitioned from mechanical systems to electronic systems. His colleagues remembered him as quiet, technically competent, and unusually good at identifying equipment problems by listening to line quality. The Army contacted him twice about consulting on signals intelligence training. Both times he declined. He was done with that work. In 1977, a military historian researching intelligence operations in the CBI Theater contacted Paige requesting an interview. By that time, much of the classified material from the war had been declassified. The historian had reviewed after-action reports mentioning Forward Signals Intelligence Station, Lido Road Sector, and identified Paige as the primary operator. Paige agreed to a single interview. It lasted 43 minutes. He answered questions factually, but without elaboration. When the historian asked how he developed the ability to recognize individual Japanese operators by their transmission styles, Paige said, "I worked for a telephone company. You learn to recognize voices and patterns. It wasn't complicated." The interview transcript became a footnote in the historian's book about CBI theater operations, published in 1981. The book sold modestly and went out of print within 3 years. Paige retired from Montana Telephone Company in 1981 at age 66. He spent retirement fishing, maintaining his house, and watching his grandchildren grow up. He developed heart problems in the mid-1980s. His health declined gradually. He died on February 4, 1989, at age 74. His obituary in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his 40-plus years in the telecommunications industry, his marriage, his children and grandchildren, his membership in the Elks Lodge, and his military service in World War II. There was no mention of intelligence work, no mention of Burma, no mention of the telephone lunatic who'd saved hundreds of American lives by listening to enemy radio operators and recognizing patterns in their voices. The story disappeared. For 43 years, Mitchell Paige's contribution to the war existed only in declassified military reports that few people read, and in the memories of soldiers who'd served in the CBI theater, and gradually passed away without recording their stories. Then, in 2017, a graduate student researching signals intelligence history stumbled across the after-action reports for Paige's monitoring operation while working in the National Archives. The student recognized that the documented results, 67 prevented ambushes, hundreds of lives saved, all based on one operator's pattern recognition, represented something unusual enough to warrant deeper investigation. The graduate student tracked down Paige's surviving family members, obtained copies of his personal papers that Dorothy had kept after his death, and cross-referenced the military documentation with interviews from other CBI theater veterans. The resulting thesis, published in 2019, detailed Paige's operation and argued that it represented one of the most effective individual intelligence contributions of the Pacific War, while remaining almost completely unknown to military historians. The thesis received limited attention in academic circles, but led to several follow-up articles in military history publications. Some veterans organizations took notice. In 2022, a Montana Historical Society added information about Paige to their World War II exhibit. But Mitchell Paige remained fundamentally unknown outside small circles of military intelligence historians. He never appeared in popular histories of the war. No documentaries featured his story. His name remained absent from most accounts of the Burma campaign. He'd done exactly what he set out to do: listen carefully, recognize patterns, save lives. Then he'd come home, worked a quiet job, raised a family, and died without seeking recognition. The Army had told him his work was impossible. He proved them wrong. That had been enough. The techniques Mitchell Paige developed in a bamboo bunker in Burma became foundational elements of modern signals intelligence doctrine. His method of identifying individual radio operators through transmission pattern analysis, what signals intelligence specialists now call operator fingerprinting, is standard practice in electronic warfare. Modern systems use algorithms and artificial intelligence to accomplish what Paige did by ear, but the fundamental principle remains identical. Individual operators have distinctive patterns that can be recognized and tracked. His use of signal strength comparison for rough triangulation, while crude by modern standards, demonstrated that effective intelligence could be gathered with minimal equipment when properly applied. This principle influenced post-war development of lightweight signals intelligence equipment for forward deployment. His emphasis on systematic logging and cross-referencing intercepted communications with other intelligence sources became standard methodology for signals intelligence analysis. The Army incorporated elements of Paige's techniques into signals intelligence training by the late 1940s. The specific lessons from his Burma operation influenced American signals intelligence operations in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. But perhaps the most significant legacy was conceptual rather than technical. Paige proved that individual skill and attention to detail could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. Military doctrine said signals intelligence required extensive resources, specialized training, and sophisticated equipment. Paige demonstrated that determination, pattern recognition ability, and systematic methodology could produce exceptional results with minimal resources. The lesson resonated beyond signals intelligence. It suggested that conventional wisdom about what was possible or impossible might be less reliable than careful observation and innovative thinking. Yet this lesson remained largely unknown, because the story remained largely unknown. The Burma campaign itself receives limited attention in popular histories of World War II. The WWII theater was a sideshow compared to Europe and the Pacific Island campaigns. The soldiers who fought there called it the Forgotten Theater, and they were right. Within the Forgotten Theater, intelligence operations received even less attention. Combat soldiers became war heroes. Intelligence analysts remained classified footnotes. And within intelligence operations, a single radio operator who prevented 67 ambushes by learning to recognize Japanese voices became a classified footnote. The irony is that Paige's contribution saved more American lives than many soldiers who received far greater recognition. A Medal of Honor recipient might save a dozen lives through extraordinary valor. Paige saved hundreds by sitting quietly and listening carefully, but valor creates dramatic stories. Careful listening creates intelligence reports. The war remembers drama. It forgets patience. Mitchell Paige represents thousands of soldiers whose contributions changed outcomes without generating headlines. The soldiers who maintained equipment that worked flawlessly under impossible conditions. The soldiers who noticed small details that prevented disasters. The soldiers who solved problems through persistence and innovation rather than heroism. They won the war as surely as any combat soldier. But they won it quietly, without witnesses, in ways that didn't translate into compelling narratives. Paige's story matters because it reveals the hidden infrastructure of victory, the unglamorous work that makes dramatic achievements possible. The leader road convoys could only supply forward troops because soldiers like Paige kept them safe from ambush. The Burma campaign succeeded in part because Japanese forces couldn't coordinate effectively once their communications were compromised. History remembers the battles. It should also remember the quiet Montana telephone operator who learned to recognize enemy voices and saved hundreds of lives by paying attention when everyone else dismissed the possibility as impossible. 67 ambushes that never happened. Hundreds of American soldiers who came home because one radio operator with a captured Japanese radio and a telephone operator's ear for patterns refused to accept that what he was attempting was impossible. Military doctrine said signals intelligence required linguistics training, sophisticated equipment, and extensive support infrastructure. Mitchell Paige did it with a dictionary, pattern recognition, and persistence. Command told him intercepting enemy communications was theoretically possible but practically worthless. He proved them wrong 67 times. After the war, he returned to Montana, maintained telephone lines, coached youth baseball, and never mentioned that he'd been the telephone lunatic who'd terrorized Japanese forces across the Burma theater. He died quietly at age 74. His story disappeared for 43 years, but it's not disappeared anymore. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Every like helps rescue another forgotten soldier from the silence that swallowed Mitchell Paige for 4 decades after his death. These stories deserve to be told. Your like makes that possible. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing you untold stories from World War II every week. Real soldiers, real innovation. Real courage that had nothing to do with battlefield heroics and everything to do with skill, persistence, and refusing to accept the limits everyone else believed were absolute. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Japan, the Philippines, India. Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of preserving these memories. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us if you learned something new today. Tell us if you've ever worked in telecommunications and recognized the pattern recognition skills Paige used. Just let us know you're here. And if you know someone who would appreciate this story, a veteran, a history enthusiast, someone who loves stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, share this video with them. Send them the link. Help us build a community that refuses to let these soldiers disappear into silence. Mitchell Paige sat in a bamboo bunker for 11 months, listening to enemy voices while everyone told him he was wasting his time. He saved hundreds of lives. He changed the outcome of an entire theater of operations. He proved that one soldier paying attention could accomplish what entire intelligence organizations couldn't. Then he came home, worked a quiet job, and died without recognition. That's not acceptable. We're telling his story now, and you're helping make sure it doesn't disappear again. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history. Thank you for helping us preserve the memory of soldiers like Mitchell Paige, who deserved better than to be forgotten. These men fought for a world worth living in. The least we can do is remember them. Hit that like button, subscribe, comment, share, be part of keeping these stories alive. Until the next Untold story, remember them.